So hello and welcome to the Out Pod. My name is James, your host, and today I'm joined by Olivier Wagner. And we met via a podcasting kind of guest service in which I got an email from yourself saying who you are and what you do, and that you want to be a guest on this podcast, which is great. I was wondering if you'd like to share with everyone listening where you're from and where you've lived, more important.
Right, absolutely. Yes, I grew up in France, French parents, French everything. I lived there until 2004, at which point I studied in Louisiana for a year. Then I worked in New York until 2011. I became a US citizen in 2009. In 2011, I moved to Canada, which is when I started becoming a tax preparer, preparing tax returns for Americans overseas. But by 2015, my longing to travel hit me again. And I went to a lot of places in Southeast Asia, Georgia, and others from 2015 to 2018. When I moved back to Canada, became Canadian 3 months ago, and now I'm in Mexico.
Amazing. Well, what a great introduction, and we'll dig a bit deeper in the podcast. So hello, welcome to section 1 of the podcast, all about getting there. But Olivier, this is kind of where you kind of give the listener kind of a reasoning, the why you wanted to leave, and then more importantly, the how, because that's usually what everyone thinks about. They know they want to leave, but it's just how do I make that dream happen? So your first move was from France to the US to study. What was the metrics for that? Why did you want to go study in the US and not stay in Europe?
I had this dream of freedom for quite some time. I had my eyes on Brazil, but by the time I graduated from high school, etc., I had this idea of freedom, which might be stereotypical, that the US would embody freedom, that I would be more successful there. And that's where it took me. I studied for a year in a university in the US. And by the way, speaking of the how, it was a lot cheaper to be enrolled in a French university and use an exchange program to study there than enrolling with an American university and paying tuition there directly. So if anybody plans on doing that, try to do an exchange program that's cheaper. Then I met my first wife, and there was like some diplomatic things that had to happen between the two universities. So as a result of that, I studied in finance, even though my major was accounting in France. And that got me ready to work in New York. I studied for the CFA exam. I passed the past 2 levels of that. Even though that's not where I stayed in the end, that's allowed me to work there for a few years.
Amazing. And when you were choosing the courses to do, or the exchange program you were doing, what was that process like? Was there many options you had, or was it just the one university, your university back in Europe, was best aligned?
So my French school had partnerships with a few American universities. So I picked one, and the idea was that we would have equivalent courses. I would take a class in the US, and it would transfer into getting credit for the class I would have taken had I stayed in France. The thing is that I was majoring in accounting, and the head of the accounting department of the American university was quite stubborn, said, no, these courses are not equivalent because they prepare for the US CPA exam. Was the head of the finance department was a lot more flexible. So I ended up taking finance classes, which were a lot less similar, but that's how that turned out. And so I took the finance classes to get credit for the accounting classes in France. So, I mean, everything, if you enroll in a French or European university to take part of an exchange program, the university will coordinate things and check with you what are the options, etc.
Did you have any other choices of country, or was it just the US?
Oh, no, there were others. I mean, again, I had my eyes set on the US at that point. I mean, there's Erasmus, which provides the same sort of thing subsidized by the European Union within the European Union. So obviously that there would have been options in most European countries. Well, it's been a while, I don't remember exactly what were the options outside outside Europe, but there were others. It wasn't just the US.
No worries. I guess the accommodation was all supported by the university as well, and all the travels supported by your course.
Right, so the region of France where I was enrolled in school provided subsidies that helped me pay for my travel, which was an oddity actually. In other parts of France, that wouldn't have been the case. And and I paid tuition to my French schools as I otherwise would have, and that. And the American university graciously hosted me with the promise that in exchange, American students would do the same. They would pay tuition to their American university and take classes in France, which would be quite a bad deal for them. But again, the cost of tuition is not similar between France and the US. So if you are American and you want to study in France, contact the French school directly and get a French degree instead of doing the exchange programs.
Yeah, even in England, where it's a bit more expensive than Europe to study, it's still nowhere near as expensive as the US, even with the international fees.
Right. So in the US, they have what's called an in-state fee and an out-of-state fee. So either for Americans who live in the US, they get a lower fee, which is still insane, if they study in the state they live in. If they want to study in another state, they pay the out-of-state fee, which is like twice the amount, which would also be the amount that international students pay. So
then, did you go back after your exchange, or did you then just stay?
Well, I essentially stayed in the US. I moved to New York and I looked for a job there. I had a fancy visa, and then I married my wife and I got a green card. So I just went through the staffing agencies. I showed my resume. They introduced me to employers. I got a 2-week stint, and then I had a stint for 2 months with Moody's, the credit rating agency, and they liked me, so they offered a permanent position.
And then once you got your citizenship to America, then you went to Canada?
Well, I was still in the US for 2 years after that, but then, yes, I moved to Canada, and I was working for Moody's, in the 2008 era during the financial crisis. And there was the HR policies got worse in terms of, I've heard stories, and I saw the end of it, of Moody's being almost like an academic institution, having lots of money, having parties for employees, these sort of things. And that's kind of disappeared. And also positions that before had their own office with the actual door and everything were downgraded to cubicles, and having the noise, etc., just like didn't make for a great work environment. And it was the financial crisis. They knew that we wouldn't get a job elsewhere, so they were cutting costs. And so with that, I didn't really want to work for someone else, and I got the idea of starting 1040 Abroad and working for myself. I looked at, and back then, like, remote work is a thing now. There was COVID-19 and all of that, but back then, essentially, you had to work for yourself if you wanted to work remotely. And I looked at, the skill sets of people who were doing that, and some were working in IT, some were artistic, and I found someone who was preparing tax returns on that basis. And I thought that's what was the most fitting with my experience and my skill set. So immediately after moving to Canada, I sat for the annual agent exam, which is not too well known, but it's an exam given by the IRS, the US tax authorities, which essentially is the tax portion of the CPA exam.
So once you passed that, then is that when you decided to change location? Was there a reason why you wanted to go to Canada?
Well, when my wife got a job at an English-speaking university in Montreal, so that was the reason why I moved to Canada. But at the same time, I didn't really want to look for a job, as I mentioned. So I became an enrolled agent, and then I bought a website from ClientWise, which is like the similar to Wix for accountants. And I just I started accepting clients, and I was kind of learning as I was servicing clients. I didn't take phone calls because I didn't want to be questions on an issue that I wasn't familiar with. And I had a cluster of clients from Geneva, Switzerland, who, for whatever reason, found me on my website. And that was my first clients. A couple of them are still clients to this day. And they would send me an email, and I would spend the next 48 hours just like doing my research to see how I could service them and what the tax issues were, because as good as the Enrolled Agent exam was, it wasn't really designed for international clients. They were mostly testing domestic concepts, some of which were still applicable to me, others were not. But foreign tax credit, foreign income exclusion were tested lightly. Controlled foreign corporation, PFIG, were completely absent from that exam because it was for US tax preparers at large, not necessarily for those servicing Americans overseas. So yes, that's how it started. Ultimately, in 2014, I joined an accounting firm in Montreal. I became a CPA, which didn't really give me much more rights with regards to the IRS, but gave me more recognition. Clients know what a CPA is. They don't know what an enrolled agent is necessarily. And I've been growing ever since, right?
So then once you started this kind of online business primarily out of Canada, you then went traveling quite a lot around the world, kind of being a nomad.
Right. It was a little unfair to my Canadian employer, the accounting firm that gave me the experience to become a CPA, but I was longing to be independent, hit the road. And right before I quit, I had coffee with an attorney in Toronto. I still work with him. His name is John Richardson, and he specializes in people who give up U.S. citizenship, but he is not too keen on preparing tax return. He likes the immigration side of things better. So we've had a great partnership since. And yes, I bought a one-way plane ticket to Bangkok, even though I had not been to Asia before that. And I joined a community of digital nomads who were living in Chiang Mai and other parts of Southeast Asia.
And so what made you choose Thailand? Was it the cost of living? Was it the community you found online there, or was it just the whim?
It was the community. It's called Dynamite Circle. They have their landmark event called DCBKK in October in Bangkok. So I went there. And then they had a mountain event called the Entrepreneur House in Chiang Mai. So I really didn't know all that much. I just followed the community, and I learned about the places as I was there.
So how long did you spend in Bangkok then?
It was, in Thailand, all in all, a little over 6 months. I had, back then, they issued a 3x 60-day visa. So it was a tourist visa, technically, and I couldn't stay 6 months. I had to leave for a day and come back and get another 60 days. So yes, I stayed there for almost 6 months. I went to Bali for New Year's. I enjoyed Ubud. It's very, very chill. When people speak about Bali and they go to Canggu, it feels a little bit too built up. It feels a little bit too much like Cancun. But if you go to inland, you go to Ubud, it feels very chill. And with all of the religious events, the Hindu processions, they have 2 religious holidays, and the stores don't necessarily close because that would be 1 day out of 2. But they have these processions with the flowers and everything that kind of block the road, but it's more beautiful than anything else. And the rice fields and all of that feels very, very calming.
Amazing. And then, so once you kind of hit the east, where was your next location?
Well, I spent some time in Georgia. I had some views on citizenship there. I had some contacts who said it was easy, and it was before it became well known, and then they got flooded with applicants, became more picky, as I understand. But it was a great experience seeing a post-communist country, and they have great food. They have this dish with cheese, egg, and bread, and other things. I enjoyed it, and and then I took a transatlantic cruise, which allowed me to check quite a few Caribbean countries more easily than it would have been otherwise. I ended up in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and I was feeling a little adventurous. And so I spent a week in Haiti, which wasn't exactly safe back then, but it was much safer than it is now. And I spent some time in Latin America. Actually, the town when I was in December and January, Sayulita and San Pancho. Back then, San Pancho didn't really have much in the way of internet, only the main hotel had decent internet. Things have greatly improved since. But that was my last location before moving to Toronto, Canada.
And then so you moved back and got some citizenship in Canada. And so what was the reason for doing that?
Well, when I moved to Montreal in 2011, first I was on a work permit, and then I got permanent residency. So it's easier to move to Quebec, especially if you speak French. But you have an added layer of bureaucracy. You first need to get a document from Quebec saying that you meet their requirements. They have a point system. You have more points if you're younger. You have more points if you're married, if you have kids, if you have a diploma, if you speak French, etc. And so they process your application. They check that you are what you say you are. And then once they approve you, you get that paper to the Canadian consulate, which then checks your criminal history and your health status, because Canada has free healthcare. So I want to make sure that you don't have a recurrent disease, right? So it takes about a year to get approval from Quebec, and then another year to get approval from the Canadian federal government before you get your actual visa and get permanent resident status. So that took me almost until 2014. And you need to spend 2 out of 5 years to keep permanent residency, spend 2 out of 5 years in Canada, and 3 out of 5 years to apply for citizenship. And as I traveled between 2015 and 2018, I still had the 2 out of 5 years, barely, to keep my permanent residency, but I was short of the 3 out of 5 to apply for citizenship. So that was only back in 2021, 2022 that I could finally apply for Canadian citizenship.
Oh, wow. And now you're in Mexico. How long have you been there for? What was the process for that? Is it a tourist visa?
Yes, I'm staying on a tourist visa. I was in Serbia for business, and I applied for a Mexican visa there, and seeing someone who's not Serbian, I think, freaked them out. They denied my visa for no reason. It's very funny because they had like this sheet of paper with what would have been valid reasons, like non-satisfactory consular interview, for instance, which could mean they don't like what you said during the interview. They don't have to say you why. But they didn't even check that and just like said other reasons you don't qualify. I'm like, dude, you had so many reasons to deny me. Like, anyway, you need to have about $70,000 of assets to get temporary residency. And they would give you a card, so you get the visa, then you go to Mexico, you go to immigration, they give you a 1-year card. Then 1 year later, you renew it for 3 more years. And 3 years later, you renew it and you get permanent residency. So that's the normal way to get residency, or you can overstay. I love it because Mexico was open throughout COVID-19. There was virtually no restriction in traveling to Mexico. There was some capacity restrictions with the hotels. Hotels couldn't sell their rooms, depending. They could sell 60% or 80% of their rooms, depending on how bad COVID-19 was at the time. And there was no breakfast buffet. Instead of serving yourself, you had to ask the employee which food you wanted, and they will serve you. You couldn't directly serve yourself. So that was COVID-19 restrictions in Mexico, which was a lot later than in other places. But Mexico saw an opportunity in having foreigners stay. And they said if you had gone to Mexico at any point before January 1st, 2020, I think they moved it to January 1st, 2021 now. You went to Mexico for a week in 2017, that's great. So if you had been to Mexico at any point before, and you overstay your tourist visa or the 6 months they give you when you travel without a visa, then you can get temporary residence. So you just need to overstay, and then you apply for the regularization program. And unlike the regular procedure, they don't give you 1 year and then 3 years. They give you 4 years all at once, and 4 years later, you would renew it into permanent residency. So that does not apply to people who've never been to Mexico before. So you cannot just go to Mexico if you've never been before. But if you have, then that's another way to do it. And, since my visa got denied, I'm here as a regular tourist. And they give you 6 months, no questions asked. So that's good. There's a few countries that are as open as Mexico, but they're not as developed as Mexico is. Like Cambodia has a visa on arrival that costs $30, and it is a sticker, but you don't have to go to the consulate. They tape it to your passport at the airport, and it's valid for 1 year. So that's another country where it's super easy to stay.
Is there anything else you wish to talk about before moving to all these places? Or are you quite happy with the extensive list we've kind of gone through already?
No, I don't have anything in mind right now.
Perfect. Well, we can go into section 2. So hello and welcome to section 2 of the podcast, all about being there. So Olivier, this is where kind of go through your first impressions of all these amazing places you've visited and lived, the cultural differences you've experienced, any cultural shock you might have experienced, any reverse culture shock. So you're looking back at your places you've lived before and seeing how they've changed in your viewpoint. It's quite an interesting thing to maybe touch upon. And then one of the most popular things we'll talk about is food. And as a Frenchman, it must be very close to your heart. So, I don't know if you want to go through your experience of studying in the States compared to Europe or France. What was that like, your first impression of, the southern part of the state?
Well, I mean, in the US, universities are campus. That's like a small enclosed town, and most people there have cars, and they would commute to and from campus, which wasn't my case. I didn't have a car, and so my life was the campus. Yeah, I mean, the food is American food. Yeah, like they had this cafeteria with cafeteria food. Sometimes I would stay and I would study, and they would open up for the next meal, and I could have 2 meals for the price of one. I was a student. I was broke back then. But it's a stark difference with France, where the university is in the middle of the city, right? There are accommodations for students, but they're just cheaper, subsidized, smaller accommodations. But they're essentially apartment buildings that are within walking distance of the school. But even within these 10 or 15 minutes walk you would have, the regular city. You would have restaurants, you would have stores, you would have people commuting to and from work. Was the US as this campus? I mean, there's the student unions, there's parties that students organize. It's not that at all, but it's on planets, whereas in France it's very much integrated.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I don't know. In my experience, the UK kind of has both. So we have like some small towns or villages which have a university attached to it, like Loughborough in the middle of the country, which has become its campus essentially. But then I studied in Liverpool, I did a master's living in Oxford, and that was right in the heart of the city. So you have, I prefer the city life, like you said, you mentioned with the experience you had in France, as opposed to the campus life, because you don't get the fatigue of just seeing the same bunch of students or only students. You get to kind of see the seasonal aspect of academic life, where everyone's got exams, everyone's really stressed, and then everyone's big parties. Doesn't really exist in a city, because everyone's just working, and there's a constant current of energy.
Yeah, and you can go out, you can go shopping at the mall, you can go to some bar in the city, you can maybe not go in nature, but I was in Saint-Étienne, which is a fairly small town, but it's less than an hour away from Lyon, which is the third largest city in France. So, and you can take public transportation, go to the Saint-Étienne train station, and then go to the Lyon train station, and then, go to the mall across the street. Was obviously none of that exists in the US. I mean, New York has pretty good public transportation, but aside from that, it's a completely different world. Even decent cities like Indianapolis would have, one bus every hour downtown and like 2 buses a day in the suburbs. It's insane. Like you need to be really poor to rely on public transportation in the US. And it's very sad, because that kind of colors Americans' perception of public transportation. They're like, only people really cannot have a car do that, because it's so bad in the US that indeed that's the case. But in Europe, that's a good feature. You don't have to worry about parking your car. You don't have to worry about the expenses that come with your car breaking down and all of that. Like, it's a great experience, but that's not something Americans would see unless they were to travel to other parts of the world.
The more and more I see of the rest of the world, and I still think the UK is not quite bad public transport. London's good. Liverpool's right, it was okay. But I don't know, to get in between cities is very difficult. The network exists, but the trains are never on time. They're always very expensive. They're going through a lot of issues at the moment.
Yeah, I've heard that they privatized a good chunk of the train services, and that leads to decrease in quality.
Yeah, I completely agree, because you don't choose your train provider, you choose the time which suits you to get somewhere, and that becomes the only train you get. So it's a monopoly, but which is why it should be public. But that's more politics. Yeah. So your life then in the States, what was it like in terms of socializing? So obviously you met your wife there, so that must have been a social party, or was it through studying? How did you?
Yes, student parties. We studied in the same school. Actually, I met her in France. Yeah, and then we just spent time together, going to the movies and stuff, which again is easier when you can easily access the city. And yeah, there was quite a few student parties organized. That was good.
Yeah, and then looking at moving to New York, you can compare that to, I guess, life in the south of the States compared to the north. How different was that experience, the metropolis that is New York City?
Well, in a sense, it was a metropolis, and it definitely is. In a sense, it was a little bit more European, not just in terms of public transportation, but in terms of political views, in terms of curiosity for international matters. When I joined the university in Louisiana, the dean gave us a speech as to how important it was to have foreign students, because locals are not exposed to the outside world. And he gave us this example of this old lady who lived in Uma, and she had to attend jury duty in New Orleans, and she had never been to New Orleans. And there's this TV, Fox News, for the most part, the local stations of Fox News, which would report all of the crimes taking place. And it happens a certain time of the day in certain neighborhoods, but they don't really do nuances, right? They try to be sensational. And so this old woman was scared out of her mind about going to New Orleans for her jury duty. And then when you go to New York, there's all of these immigrant neighborhoods. And so people have a lot more exposures to culture in other countries, to seeing things firsthand as opposed to relying on the media. And that was great. And I enjoyed the riverfront, and I found freedom in that. At first, at least, working in New York felt freeing. I would, leave my desk and go to the local Hallmark, read some jokes on the card, and walk along the river to Battery Park before going back to work. And as long as the work was done, my employer, was flexible on the hours. And the United Nations, I mean, you should do the guided tour. It's nice to do at least once. But without doing that, you can enter the headquarters and go to the gift shop and the postal office. And the gift shops has sections of gifts that come from every country, which I found fascinating. Back then, you could roam in the gardens as well. I think you can only go there as part of a tour now, which is sad. And what else was there? Oh, there was a Japanese bookstore that I loved as well for Japanese people who live in New York. And they have a floor for English books, for books in Japanese, and then they had a floor for accessories. And the accessories are so cute. It could be like a coin purse or a card or a pen or whatever it was. And it would work the same way as another one, but it would be much more cute and colorful. Now going to Chinatown. Speaking about Chinatown, I love the one in Flushing a lot more than the one in Manhattan because it was a lot more authentic in a way. You didn't really have non-Chinese people venture into Flushing, whereas that's much more the case in Manhattan.
Wonderful. And then your experience then moving to Canada, obviously still quite a Western country, still quite on the outside, similar to the States with a few nuances. What were your first impressions of Canada like?
Well, something weird happened not when I moved to Montreal, but when I visited Montreal when I was still living in New York, when we went there for 4 days or something like that. And I kind of had the feeling of visiting France as a tourist. Like the cuteness of France I could see without the negative aspects that I had left. It felt a lot more American when I moved there permanently. And there's definitely cultural differences between English-speaking Canadians and French-speaking Canadians. But something that might offend them, but it's true, is like Quebecers are much more similar to North Americans who happen to speak French than they are to French people who would happen to be misplaced into North America. So there's a certain sense of fashion, food, and community that might come from France. But when it comes to transportation methods and having a taste for big stuff, which is a lot more North American that you would find in Quebec as well.
And the language, I'm not fluent in French at all. I can say about 5 things. One of them is je ne comprends pas.
Very useful. I use it in German. I say, ich weiß nicht.
No. It's very useful to know the words for I don't know in a language. I thought it's very good. Similarly, with away le croissant. It was quite a common one I used a lot. But from my understanding of Canadian French, it's got a lot different, I guess, French from France itself. Whether that's the development of the language over time, I've heard it's been seen as similar to what French was like when the years of colonialism
it's easily understood by a French person. I mean, especially when you deal with people in Montreal. In the countryside, they might have a strong accent, but not in Montreal. In any case, right? So they took the French that they spoke 200 years ago because that's when they moved to Quebec, and so there's a lot of old words that they're still using that in France we understand because that should have been an old French that you happen to be aware of, but that's not words we use. And then there are modern words that obviously a lot of the literature in Canada has to be bilingual. So there would be a lot of translation from the English. And when they come up with a new word, sometimes they're very intentional in creating a word that is not English. But more often than they wish, they would do a literal translation from the English. And sometimes it's obvious, like the code that you enter at the ATM is the code secret, it's the secret code in France. But in North America, it's the PIN, personal identification number. In Quebec, it's the NIP, numéro d'identification personnelle, which is a literal translation from the English. And sometimes it's not obvious which one it is, because an old word for beverage is breuvage. 200 years ago in France, people would call it breuvage. Now they would call it boisson. But in English, they would call it beverage, which sounds a lot like breuvage. So, and of course, like the Quebecers will insist, no, it's old French, etc. Like, yeah, it is, but it also sounds a lot like the English word. So sometimes you can say whether it's an old French word that they're still using. Sometimes you can say whether it's a literal English translation. And sometimes you're not so sure. It's a little bit of both.
I guess it's quite useful that a lot of English comes from France. Because like intensities and densité, and we have quite a lot of shared language from Latin, I suppose, with the other part of English being Germanic. That might help them in terms of understanding stuff, but it doesn't help you in terms of understanding who is French or English they're speaking.
I mean, the rest of the sentence would be in French, so you know that they're speaking French. It's just when it's different from the French spoken in French, you have this curiosity as to whether it's old French or whether it's a literal translation. And Quebecers would downside the literal translation. They would assure you that it's not. But sometimes it is, and sometimes it clearly is.
I know in France you have a government department just for making new words up, because a lot of new words tend to stem from popular culture, which would probably either be in Spanish or in English or in, I guess, Chinese or Mandarin. So you protect your language, because I know I've got friends from Sweden and from Germany who will just say German or Swedish and then throw in the English word that's new in English, and that would just be the word they use. Where in France, I've really tried to put a French word in.
Yeah, what you're talking about is Académie Française, and they're essentially useless. Whatever the Quebecers do is more effective. So yeah, it dates back to the French Revolution, so 200 years ago. There was this circle of people who, they're very old actually. I think the average age is about 65. A lot of them are in their 70s or 80s. And so they legislate on the French language. They say how French should be spoken, and they create new words, etc. And so when the internet came about, in English you had emails to refer to messages that are sent electronically, right? And so the people who use the internet in France called it email because that's what it was called in the US. And we borrow English words a lot more than the Quebecers. We're not shy of it. We're not scared of it. It just is, whereas the Quebecers are scared that if they borrow a word, then all of the sudden their whole identity would be lost. So people who use the internet call it email. They use the English word. And people in the Académie Française obviously didn't use the internet because they're quite old. And so not too long after that, the Quebecers created the word courriel, courrier électronique, courriel, to refer to email, which kudos for them. They created something that was not a literal translation from the English. And that word was actually used by the population in Quebec, because as they were grasping the concept of email, that concept was introduced to them as being a courriel. So that's the word they used. In France, as people grasped the concept of email, they used the word email because that was the word that was used. There was no other word. And like a couple of years later, like 2 or 3 years later, when everybody already used the word email, the Académie Française came out and said that we should use the word mail, M-E-L, messagerie électronique. And the French government in the official publications has been using the word mail, M-E-L, and as a result, people know what it is. But they still use email because it was too late. By the time the word mail, M-E-L came out, they already used email. And once an habit is created, it's much harder to change it than if you introduce it when the habit starts about. So,
it's a really interesting language and how it evolves. And I guess someone like yourself who's traveled quite a lot will kind of have first-hand experience on how even language in the same spoken language can vary. I guess a lot of French-speaking parts of the world. When you're into the Caribbean, I'm sure you may have visited some of the French-speaking islands and how their French may be completely different to French that you spoke all your life and everything else.
Right. And even the difference in English between American and Canadian English. You would have pub in Canada and soda in the US, for instance.
I always feel that you speak to someone who speaks English as a second language, especially from some parts of Europe. They speak American English because a lot of media and popular television is in American English. So I felt as a British person living abroad, I was an ambassador for the English language, like using the correct spellings of words, the correct pronunciations, the correct actual words. So it's not a elevator, it's a lift, and not a sidewalk, it's a pavement.
Exactly, yeah.
It's just a beauty of how people develop the language, and it's another talking point, the thing to discuss and share interesting anecdotes over and the reasons why there's different expressions for the same thing is quite interesting to me anyway. Can I continue on your life abroad then? We've got a sidetrack bit there. You then went to be a nomad for a bit. How did you find that? Constantly moving around. I know you spent some extended time in a lot of places. What was that like initially?
There was definitely some excitement about discovering new things, about being free to do whatever and be wherever. After a while, you kind of want to slow down. Right now, I would want to spend at least 3 months in a given place. That was not the case. It's exhilarating. At first you're out of your comfort zone and it feels great, and then you really get comfortable with living that way.
Nice. And what's the social life like comparing, being somewhere permanently, having the same group of friends to what you've got now, which might seem more exciting. You're meeting new people all the time, but is it a bit more lonely because you see people for a few weeks and then they go and you're constantly crossing over?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I was part of this group, the Dynamite Circle, and I attended a lot of their events to meet the same group of people in different places and having a social life that way. But yeah, there's definitely a lonely aspect to digital nomad life, especially if you're single and you're on your own.
And did you find that help kind of get over that initial loneliness was to really throw yourself into that group?
I never really quite got used to it. I moved to Canada. I moved back to Canada in 2018. I met my current wife then, and now we are having that lifestyle together, so we're not lonely. But for someone who's not in that situation, that's definitely a drag to the digital nomad lifestyle. There's no way of denying that.
And how did you find the kind of social groups? Was it through social media like Reddit or Facebook?
I don't know. Oh, I've been following the Topical MBA, which is the non-member version of the Dynamite Circle. And I followed them since 2010, 2011. And it's only, once I made the jump that I met these people in person, and I met them in various occasions, as I mentioned. I'm afraid I don't know how I became aware of that group in the first.
No, it's not a hopefully you talking about it will then make people aware of it now. So of course, how they know about that Dynamite Circle will be from this podcast. I hope it's a new origin story for the information. So that's not a problem at all. And then kind of going more into your life back in the States, so in terms of culture shocks or reverse culture shocks, when you look back at life in France after living abroad for so long, do you view it differently? What might have changed for your perception of life in France?
I sense a certain pessimism in French culture that I try to run away from. That's what was so interesting about going to Montreal, doing that one trip. I could see France without, in all of its beauty, which I don't necessarily see in France. And I know that someone would not have lived there, would not have spent their childhood there, would see it differently. So, yeah, there's definitely some culture shock, and I'm not sure how to overcome it, really.
Do you miss anything from home, like raclette or good food? Or
Yes, there's definitely a certain taste in food, in desserts in particular. Like North American desserts tend to be overpowering, to have very strong taste of chocolate or something else. I find French dessert to be more balanced. And that's something that's staying with me despite everything else.
That's quite a specific one, but a really, really great point to mention that, maybe something for Americans visiting France that they will need to really refine the taste to enjoy dessert, or expect it to be more subtle. I guess it's trying like tasting wine. You've got to try and look for the notes and flavors as opposed to saying, "Oh, that's strong." Is there anything else you want to talk about your life abroad, language and how you found that, or we have talked about quite extensively? So maybe you exhausted that topic, but
It's just like everything else. Like my parents very much wanted me to learn German because I grew up close to the border, and especially before the euro, people in that region made a lot of money by working in Germany. And I was quite rebellious. I refused to learn German. Hence the Isbaisnicht that I mentioned earlier. And I had an obsession for Brazil, but there was no Portuguese class taught in the city where I grew up in. So I started learning Spanish to the point that my Spanish was very good when I graduated from high school. And of course, I was into video games. I was learning English. That was the other language that was taught anywhere. And aside from that, I took online classes to learn Chinese in 2008, and I still have some very rudimentary knowledge of it. Aside from that, I mean, it's a good combo. You can get by in a lot of places with French, English, and Spanish. I mean, if you go to Asia and you don't speak Spanish, you're a clown. Like, what kind of white person doesn't speak English, right? Yeah, so...
I mean, you can say what kind of clown only speaks English, but then...
Yeah, I mean, they would have learned English to speak with foreigners, and if you don't speak English, then you won't really have a medium of communication. Like, if you don't speak a language other than English, they won't realize that because they would be trying to speak to you in English anyway.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, has your English improved since? Well, I guess moving to America would have improved your English quite substantially, but and the working culture.
Yes, I mean, in 2001, I got a summer job in the US, and I was calling employers in the US to get a job. And I would ask them to repeat what they were saying, because like face to face, I could understand and speak English, but without being able to read lips, I had difficulties. And they were like, if you don't understand me now, you're not qualified for the job. And they would just like hang up on me. And there was a job fair organized by the organization I would use to get the visa in Paris. And I went to Paris for the day, and I got a job to work at a theme park in Ohio. And that was that. But yes, my English has improved substantially since.
Well, we're doing it now, albeit with video, but I hope you're feeling the slimness. Wonderful. Well, I think we should go into section 3. So hello and welcome to section 3 of the podcast, which is a kind of review of your time. So I know you're still on the journey of living abroad and now obviously living with your wife, exploring different countries together. If you could go back to when you first kind of left France and you were going to do a year abroad, what best advice might you give yourself to either enhance the situation, or would you avoid something? You know, is there something that kind of stands out? Perhaps buying a car?
Buy a car? I mean, there's definitely a convenience aspect to it in the US, but it comes at a cost, and a cheap car breaks down. So, you save upfront and you still have to pay quite a bit later. My wife her car is parked in Canada now, but she had the same car for the past 15 years. And while there are some repairs, she managed to have a car at a cost that is much cheaper than most people. I really admire that. So if you're going to buy a car, if you can buy a 7-year-old, very reliable car, then that's a win. But
so sadly, don't buy French cars. So I work in the car industry. So
French cars are not too widespread in North America, so that's not really the issue. But there are times when I could have been bolder, but I think I was still pretty bold, all things considering. But when I just started moving to the US, when I was discovering life overseas, I didn't really know that Asia existed, right? I mean, there was a few people who were ethnically Asian in my French town. I mean, just like 2 or 3. And so I knew that they looked different. And on a world map, I knew where Asia was. But it never occurred to me to travel there to experience a cheaper life and to experience, more colors, spicier food, etc. That's something that was really not on my radar that I could have explored earlier. And like I read these stories of people who traveled to the USSR between the time of the Berlin Wall fell and the time the USSR dissolved. That you could, once you made your way to the communist part, you could buy train tickets at the same price as locals did, which would be next to nothing for someone who saved even a tiny bit of money, even as a student. So that would have been an amazing experience that I didn't have. Obviously, it's not something that can be replicated after 1992. So, yeah, there are some experiences I could have done, but all in all, I was more interested in building a life than exploring the world, and I could have done more of that. I don't have that many regrets. Things turned out the way they did, and I'm in a good place now.
No, I think that's quite a very, very good point in terms of being bold. We could all be bolder. Like, if you're living abroad, you're bold enough because you've taken the leap, right, and done it. But then it's the difference between living abroad and then sitting in your own apartment alone, or trying to socialise, meet as many people as possible, really throw yourself into it. There's a spectrum of boldness, but everyone who's done it still definitely a bold person. And interesting your point about Asia, and you mentioned how it's much cheaper to live, so it might not be as financially rich, but maybe in experiences, it's definitely enriched your life because it's expanded your horizons to paradigms or giving you empathy which you would never have had before. And that's the beauty of travel, right? You get to see the world from the angle or the lived experiences of other people, and then maybe more decisions make sense to you. Like for me, I'm like, well, I know why people would choose to do a certain action because, well, I've seen what is important to them, or what the cultural life is like, or what the political life is like, and then they might want to have a different change. They might feel the need to do something because of what's good and what's bad in their country, which I think people judge from afar. Like that's a bit of a weird choice to make, but unless you've been there and seen it firsthand, it's quite difficult to really judge fairly. So, and even more so in parts of the world which aren't as widely influenced in our lives, like the global south and East Asia, I suppose. If you could give some advice to someone leaving France to move anywhere in the world, what might you give them?
Well, Quebec is a good stepping stone into North America. If I was to do it again, I might move to Quebec, become Canadian, and then the US is yours. There's like a list of 62 professions for which Canadians are essentially automatically given a visa if they have a job offer in the US. So if North America is your destination, you might want to move to Quebec before going elsewhere, either English-speaking Canada or the US. And it's when you want to leave France, you kind of want to go to a place that's not French, that's like the least French as possible, but that might be a good compromise. And you can still drive to Vermont for the weekend. Montreal is like 2 hours from the US border in Vermont. So that would be one way to do it. A riskier way, which might have more rewards or it might not. I don't know if you've heard the expression, jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down.
No, I've not, but I think we have similar ones of, literally just leap before you look.
Well, you still need to build wings at some point. But yeah, buying a one-way plane ticket to Chiang Mai is that. Like you have a place that opens up a lot of things. You can go to the night market and, snacks on grilled insects and go to the temples and these sort of things. And if you eat street food, it can be quite cheap, even if you don't have much income or assets. And you can network with other Westerners in the same situation who find a way to sell stuff on Amazon or provide marketing services or whatever. But it's a steeper learning curve. Right, build your wings on the way down, jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. Because if you're staying on the edge and you're not jumping, you don't really have the same incentive of building wings. Whereas if you're in a free fall, you really have an incentive to build wings on the way down. And you'll be in much more of a free fall if you go to Chiang Mai without a plan than if you have a job in Quebec, for instance. With that comes the expression being ramen noodles profitable. So you start a business, you sell your services, and you need to be ramen noodles profitable, which means you turn up enough profits to be able to feed yourself ramen noodles every meal, which is a much better position to be in than operating at a loss, right? And with the world we live in, it's saying the kind of opportunities that exist that didn't exist 20 years ago, because you can have a computer and that will be your tool that will connect you to the internet. It will connect you to various AI tools. It will connect you to all sorts of things, which are extremely complicated and evolve very quickly. So you have a steep learning curve, as I mentioned, but you don't need to make millions right away. You just need to be ramen noodles profitable so that you can live your life without going into debt. So that's the two paths that I would recommend a French person who wants to move overseas. The easy way of moving to Quebec or the hard way of moving to Chiang Mai.
And then if I can, that as a US citizen, what's your advice for someone from the US to live abroad or move abroad or travel?
Well, I don't really have much experience as a US citizen moving to Europe because I did it the other way around. Even though when I was still a kid, I was 20 years old before I moved to the US, and I had this fascination. There are staffing agencies in Paris specialized in English-speaking personnel. So that can be a stepping stone for some. I mean, the Chiang Mai reference applies equally for someone from the US as it would to someone from France. And you go into these travel groups and you can see the cultural differences between the US and France. Like in the US, they will tell you to start your business, go to Chiang Mai, develop, find a customer base, find a service that doesn't exist yet, etc., outsource things to like a factory in China and get them sent to the warehouse, the Amazon warehouse in the US and sell it on Amazon, etc. Was in France, like they speak about the unionized contracts, like, hey, if you worked for like 4 or 5 years in this job, you can take a 1-year sabbatical and they have the obligations to take you back, etc., which is a completely different mindset.
It's the opportunity, I guess. The American dream in certain ways of working for yourself and being more entrepreneurial. Maybe they'll become more unionized when they get as old as European countries, because we did the entrepreneurial side of it probably in the Victorian period. Is there anything else you wish to share with the listeners of the podcast in terms of your life abroad, or advice you want to give them? We've covered quite a lot, right?
I mean, it involves risk. You need to learn a language. You need to be curious. You need to get out of your comfort zone. But then you have the reverse cultural shock, where a certain lifestyle, a certain country might seem more familiar than the place you came from.
They're completely. Curiosity is definitely key in life abroad, and I often try to say, staying curious is the saving grace of living abroad. That you do have the constant, I guess, urge to go, oh, what's that over there? I want to go see that over there. Or, why is this language doing this way? Or why do you use this cooking method? Like in Sweden, they have kebab pizza, which is, if you ask a Turkish person or Italian person about kebab pizza, they would probably get really angry with you because it's not what they're used to. And Italians and food are probably similar to French food, where they're very precious about it. But it's just interesting how the cultures change and mix, and you have, through waves of immigration, whether it's from economic opportunity or refugees, get these mixings of life and culture and influence and ideas, and you get this fusion coming out of it of running new ideas. I think it's incredible. Like what your businesses, and we'll talk about it in a second, but you found a niche in being a US expat essentially and helping other US expats out. You wouldn't have found that.
Right. I mean, it's quite weird for someone who started as a regular French person to, be preparing tax returns for Americans who live outside the US.
Well, what a great chance for you to I guess, share your business for everyone, to give them a flavour of what you do and how you can help.
Right. Well, I operate 1040 abroad. I prepare tax returns for Americans who live overseas. And it's quite interesting in that many of them have not filed US tax returns in a while. So I have a good mix of clients between those who file their tax returns every year and those who catch up and file 3 or 4 years at once to get into compliance and keep on filing. now is a good time to get into compliance because the US issued COVID-19 stimulus checks in 2020, 2021 based on the 2019 returns that then on file. And Americans who lived overseas who didn't file returns wouldn't have received them if they had not filed a 2019 tax return. The deadline to claim this refund is June 15, 2024. So if that's your situation, please go to 1040award.com and we'll help you get these amounts. It can be up to $3,200 if your income was less than $5,000 in 2020 and 2021. Right, we can discuss it more in details, complete the contact form at 1040award.com and we can help you. The other thing I do, which is more for people who are really settled in their own country, is to help them give up their US citizenship so that they never have to file a US tax return again.
Right. There's a whole myriad of people who fit that bill. Hope you'll help people who listen, whether that's really back or get some security or remove a headache. Right. Well, thank you for sharing your experience in time. It's really interesting to see or listen to all the incredible experience you've had, understanding a bit more about French Canada in terms of its linguistic differences, which as a ignorant Englishman like I am, it's very nice to hear it from I guess a bilingual French person who can explain that to me more adequately than I can try to. Yeah, and I wish you the best in the rest of your travels. And yeah, great. Anyone who did find with this podcast, please let us know in the comments. Likewise, please send this to anyone you know who might be traveling or wants to travel or has traveled and might enjoy the nostalgic trip talking to people who've gone through similar experiences. There's never a wrong listener. So please do send it to anyone who might possibly find it enjoyable. And if you did, then please subscribe and please, get in touch, help build this community, really. We'll see you next time for the Expat Pod.